had societies of their own. They had castles. They had entire cities. They had a true social structure.
And this is actually part of the issue with the Cathars was, yes, the Pope launched a crusade on them, but it was not just grab a few heretics and burn them. This was like a true crusade, but it was in Southern Europe.
Well, the Pope is going to send emissaries, one after another, trying to go to these Cathars and instruct them that they are wrong. And one of the main emissaries is Saint Dominic. A little bit later. Anyway, so at one point, one of the papal emissaries is murdered by the Cathars. And this is just too much for the Pope.
That's the Middle Ages. It's what we do.
So the Urban II was able to call down a crusade on Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And this, is it Innocent the Third?
I believe it was Innocent
yes,
II.
Innocent the Second or Innocent the Third calls down a crusade against the Cathars. So this is adopting the ideas of crusades, same rules. You go and you fight, and you're absolved of your sins, but you're not fighting Muslims in Jerusalem. You are fighting your next door neighbors in the south of France.
And this was historically quite significant because
yes,
the Pope had a great strategy for how to get people to fight for this. He went to the King of France. Remember who he was, but he went to the King of France and said,
I know the King of France.
If you defeat these people, you get all their lands and you get to redistribute it to your friends.
No, he didn't. But that's
what?
That's another. No, not the King of France. That's another lecture.
This is part of France's unification.
Yes, but he did. Okay, the King of France had a highly centralized government. He did not give away land. He broke it up into regions, and he made the nobles administrators of each of these regions. They did not have a hereditary ownership of the land.
Okay.
The king could move them around like chess pieces whenever he wanted. And the way he got them to agree to this is that he allowed them to live tax-free.
Okay, but this region was not part of France at the time.
Correct.
It is today. And it's basically, this is part of really big countries. France, certainly by medieval standards, is huge.
Yes.
And yes, they kept losing parts of it to England and Italy. In fact,
anyway,
it was still huge. And this is part of the emergence of the modern nation, was this efforts against the Cathars. And, as I said, they had really bloody wars. They fought for hundreds of years. There's an image of them finally being defeated out of the city of Carcassonne. Carcassonne is probably one of the most beautiful cities in Europe today. Beautiful walled castle.
Still very medieval.
Still very, very lovely there. And of course, they did the usual things to the captured Cathars. That's just
burn them at the stake.
But the Pope,
they're brutal back then,
said they needed something stronger to go after these guys besides just guns, and they needed
to re-educate them. That was the hope, that they could turn these people, they could turn their heresy, because the idea was these people were ignorant. They did not understand the Orthodox system, the Orthodox thinking. And so what they needed to be done is to be educated. And so he's going to form a couple of different groups to do this.
Well, isn't there somebody who came to him with the...
Well, Dominic, two of them come. Dominic comes to the Pope and asks to start an order. These are the Dominicans. These are the black friars. They actually wore white robes with black hoods on them. And Dominic is going to create this movement. They aren't the type of monks that are shut up in a monastery. They are in with the people, preaching to them. They are an order of preachers. And they were the order that influenced study as well. They opened universities. And when we get to the New World, several hundred years later, they're going to open up universities in the New World. So the Dominicans are very important in that way. The other man who comes to the Pope, Pope Innocent III, and asks to start an order is St. Francis. Francis of Assisi, who was a young rich man who has a conversion experience, is overcome with a desire to solve poverty, and so he becomes a mendicant order, in that these are orders that are begging, basically. They go around begging, but they are there to solve the problem of poverty. But both the Franciscans and the Dominicans are busy in society trying to re-educate people, to make them understand that their heresy is wrong. But it is the Dominicans who basically, once they're done with the Cathars, they're going to move out. They're going to move into Spain.
By the way, what did they call the office that St. Dominic started to go in there and deal with these people?
The Inquisition.
Oh, really?
You mean?
I've got to find that clip file. Give me a break.
It's okay. It's okay. We already ruined the joke. We ruined
the joke, yes.
Okay.
It was the start of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
With St. Dominic.
And
but it's interesting to compare St. Francis with Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo started from the outside, tried to create some of the same ideas. St. Francis worked within the church.
Right.
And, the modern Pope is a Franciscan, and they believed in poverty. They all took an oath of poverty.
Yeah. Actually, I think this is the thing that amuses me the most. Popes have had a tradition of naming themselves. They don't live the names usually of the names they take. They take a name when they become pope, and oftentimes those names are aspirational. They send a message to the flock of what they want to do in their future. And so our current pope is Francis. What number?
There is no number.
There is no number. He's the first Francis.
I think he's the first Franciscan to be pope, isn't he?
No, he's not the first Franciscan, but he's the first Francis. He is the first pope who's out there saying, I want to solve poverty. So I think this is fascinating, gives you an insight into the man and into the structure itself.
That is cool.
Okay. It is cool. But the point is, so it was working within the church and this acceptance of charity, helping, and so on. It was just Waldo wanted to break away from the church entirely.
But the mendicant orders and the Dominicans, they were open to not only friars, not only monks, but also the laity. People who wanted to be part of this movement, who wanted to express themselves in a spiritual way, joined up with this movement as well. So the laity who joined for only small periods of time were just as important as the monks themselves. But they were very different orders than had been before.
Speaking of orders and a flashback, one of the popes, and I cannot find his image because
it's okay.
No, I know. It's work with me, babe. Work with me.
Okay.
This particular pope, his name was Innocent II. I think I'm up to Innocent III now.
Yeah.
He wasn't so innocent, and he decided to form a group of an order, a religious order, but they were also an armed religious order. They were called the Knights Templar. And they're very trendy to talk about there. Yeah.
They had been on multiple crusades.
Yes, and the Knights Templar were not answerable to their lords. That was kind of the idea. So, and they successfully took over Jerusalem.
In the first crusade, but not in the second or third or fourth.
They did pretty well. But they were exempt from all taxes. They were exempt from church tithes. So they basically, anything they got, and of course, you get forgiveness for all they got to keep. They developed their own banking system, which is really, in many ways, the origin of much of the modern banking system.
Well, anyway.
Well, I know. Anytime you talk about a point in history, there's always somebody who says, well, there's this guy 10 years before. But so the Templars were, very trendy to talk about, a lot of stories about them, but they got very rich. By the later years, by around 1300, 1250, 1300, they had 90% of them were lay people. Only 10% were actually knights and warriors, but they were parts of the Templars. But because they didn't answer to any king, only to the Pope, they could go anywhere. They couldn't be stopped. They lived these lives. They all had beards. You had to have a beard to be a Templar. They supposedly were. It's like they were a lot like the knights in Game of Thrones. They had to renounce relations with women. A group of guys together renouncing relations with women. What could go wrong? But they
nothing.
Absolutely
nothing from. I taste like shoe leather. Okay.
Yeah.
But so the Templars were out there doing their thing, and because they got very rich, people borrowed from them, including this guy, Philip. Oh, small picture. Philip IV, King of France, also known as Philip. No, Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair may have described his appearance. It certainly didn't describe his behavior, because Philip owed them a lot of money, and he was trying to unify his kingdom. So he basically told the Pope, we need to get rid of these guys. And the Pope said, but they work for me. They're good guys. And Philip the Fair said, why don't you guys go down and talk to the Pope? And a group of people went down and talked to the Pope, and the Pope died about a week later from injuries.
Yeah, they beat up the Pope.
And he went to the next Pope and said, I really like you to...
get rid of the Knights Templar?
And this guy was like, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. And also, you really should not have done this. You're in trouble. This Pope died mysteriously 6 months later.
Yeah.
And he went to the next Pope and said, we really need to get rid of the Knights Templar, and also about this excommunication you've put on me and this interdict you've put on me, northern France. And you know what the funniest thing is? This Pope said, you're right. In fact, we're going to move the Holy See to France.
Yes. They're going to move. He's going to move to the Holy See to the safest place in Italy he could find, which was France. And this begins the popes in Avignon. So from 309 to 387, the Pope 1377. The popes are going to live in southern France in the largest Gothic castle/palace ever built, because nothing says the Pope is infallible like the largest Gothic palace ever built. It's amazing. It's huge. It's still there. It's really quite something to see. But this means with the Pope in France, the bishops become French, and then they start to make new popes, and those popes happen to be French. And so the whole character of the church hierarchy starts changing because everybody's in France, which is not making the Italians very happy. Shall we get into that story?
Keep going.
What? You want me to get into the schism?
The schism.
Yeah.
Okay, there's the schism. I was gonna go ahead and kill off the Knights Templar, but you can.
Go ahead and kill off. Kill off the Knights Templar.
Well, actually, I was just going to show you something here for a second, which is I happen to have from our recent vacation some footage from the Palace of Avignon. So keep filling.
Why am I filling? Oh, okay. So this is making the rest of Europe very suspicious of what's going on in the Catholic Church, because now they're in this magnificent palace. It's absolutely gorgeous, and they're not in really the structure they had lived in before. They are in a very different lifestyle.
This is the Rhone River in southern France. This is basically, oops, I can't out.
Very nice.
Anyway, just some pretty pictures of, we just happen to have been there on a vacation, and this is the city of Avignon. Yes, we're showing you our travel photos.
Anyway, so gorgeous castles and this and that.
Anyway, this is really kind of irrelevant, but
it's very irrelevant. That's just the outer wall.
That is beautiful.
So go ahead and kill off the Templars.
Hang on, I'm trying to figure out how to exit